Maximum Canada. Why 35 million Canadians are not enough, by Doug Saunders. In his book, Maximum Canada, author Doug Saunders presents a compelling historical argument that Canada has long been hindered by a crisis of underpopulation, a self-inflicted condition rooted in a recurring set of restrictive ideas he terms the minimizing impulse. This summary follows the narrative of Canadian history as presented by Saunders, tracking the country's struggle between this impulse and a more expansive, open vision for its future. The story begins around midnight on a winter evening in Brantford, Upper Canada. A 36-year-old mother of three named Catherine Lloyd-Jones stands in fury beside her husband, William, a Welsh-born barrister. Armed rebels, their neighbors, have forced their way in, demanding the weapons the couple had hidden in anticipation of civil war. These rebels, whom Catherine denounces as Americans, champion democratic ideals, public education, and open borders. Catherine and William, staunch Tories loyal to the British Crown, see these ideas as treason. This tense standoff encapsulates the core conflict of early Canada. A war of ideas between those who envisioned a small, closed, ethnically homogeneous British colony dedicated to raw material extraction, and those who saw a larger, more diverse, and economically independent North American nation. Catherine's side won the immediate struggle. The 1837 rebellions were crushed, but the victory of her minimizing impulse would set Canada on a path of chronic underpopulation for the next century and a half. Following the War of 1812, the ruling elites, a circle of Tories in Upper Canada known as the Family Compact, slammed the border shut to American migrants who had previously formed a majority of the population. They restricted trade, censored newspapers, suppressed public education, and established the Church of England as a dominant force. Immigration was actively filtered to attract only loyal, preferably Anglican, British subjects, who were seen as suitable employees for a resource-based economy, not as innovators or entrepreneurs. This strategy created a self-defeating spiral. Canada's economy choked. With trade limited to the British Empire and high tariffs on U.S. goods, farmers couldn't sell their produce and equipment was prohibitively expensive. Ambitious and entrepreneurial people, both new immigrants and established residents, saw no future. They left. During the great 19th century migration from Europe to the New World, when tens of millions crossed the Atlantic, Canada suffered a net loss of people, a steady hemorrhage of its population to the more dynamic and opportunity-rich United States. The dream of Confederation in 1867, led by the pragmatic and nation-building first Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, was meant to solve this. Macdonald envisioned a Canada stretching from sea to sea, linked by a transcontinental railway. However, his vision remained constrained by the minimizing impulse. His signature national policy erected high tariff walls against American manufactured goods. While this protected a few Canadian industries, it made life for farmers and consumers far more expensive, stifling innovation and driving even more people south. The great project of settling the West was conceived not as an economic development plan, but as a strategic move to block American expansion. Settlers were lured with free land, but found themselves on isolated homesteads far from markets, and charged monopolistic rates by the very railway meant to serve them. The result was another failure. While hundreds of thousands of Americans populated the Dakotas, the Canadian prairies remained sparsely settled, with many homesteaders abandoning their claims for a better life in the U.S. This era also marked a tragic shift in relations with indigenous peoples. Once seen as partners in trade, they were now viewed as obstacles to territorial control.
This led to broken treaties, forced relocations to reserves, and a policy of starvation and cultural destruction, epitomized by the residential school system that would devastate indigenous communities for generations. By the 1890s, it was clear that Confederation had failed to create a prosperous, growing nation. Canada was a country of emigrants.
The tide turned dramatically with the election of Wilfrid Laurier in 1896. A sophisticated French Canadian, Laurier understood that Canada's survival depended on abandoning the minimizing impulse. For the next 15 years, his government unleashed the most productive and expansive period in Canadian history. He and his decisive interior minister, Clifford Sifton, launched an unprecedented global campaign to attract immigrants. Breaking from the British-only policy, they sent agents across Europe and the United States, advertising Canada as a land of opportunity. Sifton declared his ideal immigrant was not an English gentleman, but a stalwart peasant in a sheepskin coat. And his agents secretly circumvented European emigration bans to bring hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, and Scandinavians to Canada. This wave of immigration transformed the country. Between 1897 and 1913, Canada's population soared as 3 million newcomers arrived. This influx, combined with the loosening of trade barriers with the U.S., ignited an economic boom. Cities like Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver exploded in size. A powerful industrial economy emerged, centered on steel, hydroelectricity, and manufacturing. Ironically, the Laurier government believed it was building an agrarian nation, focusing all its recruitment efforts on farmers. In reality, the majority of immigrants and a huge number of rural-born Canadians flocked to the cities, creating the urban industrial Canada of the 20th century. For the first time, Canada became a country whose identity was not tethered to its British or French origins. This Canadian century, as Laurier famously called it, lasted only 15 years. The era's pluralism had limits. Vicious anti-Asian sentiment, particularly in British Columbia, led to a rising White Canada movement. Seizing on this and on anti-American feelings, the conservative leader Robert Borden defeated Laurier in 1911 by campaigning against a proposed free trade deal with the U.S. and stoking fears of non-British immigration. Canada snapped back to its minimizing default. The decades that followed were marked by 2 world wars, a depression, and a near-total shutdown of immigration. The 1923 Chinese Immigration Act barred almost all Chinese from entering the country for a generation. During the Holocaust, Canada notoriously turned away Jewish refugees, adopting a policy of none is too many. Once again, the country hemorrhaged people, with over 1 million Canadians, many of them the most educated and skilled, moving to the U.S. between the wars. After the Second World War, a more confident Canada slowly awoke to the reality of its own vulnerability. Britain was a diminished power, and Canada was a small, sparsely populated nation living next to a superpower. The old British-centric minimizing model was no longer viable. Slowly, reluctantly, the doors to immigration began to open again, first to displaced persons from Europe, and then quietly to a trickle of non-white immigrants from the Commonwealth. The election of John Diefenbaker in 1957 marked a final dramatic attempt to revive the old vision of a British, resource-based Canada, but the country had already changed too much. By the time of its centennial in 1967, Canada was embroiled in passionate debates over its identity, symbolized by the struggle for a new flag that revealed a profound shift. The old singular British identity was fading. Quebec's quiet revolution was demanding a new constitutional arrangement, and Indigenous peoples were beginning a long political reawakening. Canada was for the first time confronting the reality that it was a complex, pluralistic North American nation. This new understanding gave rise to what Saunders calls the maximizing consensus, a set of ideas that would shape the next 50 years. This wasn't a top-down project imposed by politicians, but a reflection of the lived reality of a changed populace. It included the recognition of pluralism, eventually formalized as multiculturalism, a view of immigration as a tool for economic growth, not ethnic engineering, a shift toward a diversified value-added economy, and an acceptance of North American economic integration, culminating in the free trade agreements of the 1980s and 90s. Crucially, it led to the constitutional recognition of indigenous peoples as sovereign partners with inherent rights. Despite this progress, Saunders argues that Canada still suffers from the legacy of its chronic underpopulation. With only 35 million people in a vast geography, the country lacks the capacity to realize its full potential. This price of underpopulation manifests in several ways. Fiscally, a small, aging population with a low birth rate strains public services like healthcare and pensions, as there are fewer working-age taxpayers to support a growing number of retirees. Economically, a small domestic market stifles innovation and competition. Canadian companies often lack the scale to compete globally, and our most talented entrepreneurs, artists, and scientists are often forced to leave the country to find the resources and audiences they need to live. Ecologically, low population density makes Canada reliant on inefficient, high-carbon transportation and housing, while denying it the tax base needed to invest in large-scale green infrastructure. Strategically, a small population limits Canada's ability to project influence on the world stage and defend its own sovereignty. Culturally, it means our media, publishing houses, and think tanks are too small to foster a robust national conversation, leaving us to consume the culture and ideas of others. To overcome this, Saunders advocates for a bold national project to grow Canada's population to 100 million by the year 2100. This is not a call for uncontrolled growth, but a deliberate, planned expansion. He argues that this can be achieved through a combination of family-friendly policies, like Quebec's affordable childcare program, to close the fertility gap and allow Canadians to have the number of children they desire, alongside a modest, gradual increase in annual immigration levels, focusing on skilled and educated newcomers. This expansion, however, comes with significant challenges that must be addressed. The changing nature of work means Canada must ensure new jobs provide security and social mobility. The high cost of housing in major cities, where most newcomers settle, threatens to create segregated and disconnected communities in the suburbs. And Canada must invest heavily in recognizing the foreign credentials of highly educated immigrants, whose talents are too often wasted in low-skilled jobs. Failure to address these issues could risk a political backlash against immigration, derailing the entire project. Ultimately, Maximum Canada is a call to action. It argues that by preparing for a larger population, by investing in denser, more efficient cities, robust social programs, and pathways to economic success, Canada will not only overcome its historical deficit, but also build a more prosperous, sustainable, and equitable country for everyone, both new and established Canadians. A larger Canada, Saunders concludes, will not feel more crowded, but more connected, more capable, and more complete.